Hey y'all! Well, this is going to be a fairly depressing video that I am not happy to be making. And I wanted to give you an update on my KT120 monoblocks after using them and listening to them, just the initial kind of, impressions of everything. And as you saw, when I had these biased up at 98% of their rated dissipation, we were getting 18 watts as it crossed over 2% distortion, and at just over 10 watts it was under 1%. Everything looked jam up and beautiful, and so hooked these things up to my clip speakers and ran my DAC into them off of my CD deck with an optical cable, so I would have some control of the volume without having some sort of preamp that might color the sound, just to hear what these things sound like. And man, they sound great. The bass is so punchy but also controlled, and just, man, they've got top end that's got sparkle. The mid-range is nice and smooth without being in your face. And then after about 30 minutes, looked over and both the tubes were red plating. I mean, and not like, the whole tube glowing bright red and thermal runaway, but the left side of both of the output tubes was definitely glowing red. The other side, nice and black, cool looking. And I'm like, what is going on? So started playing around with the bias adjustment on them, and to get them to not show any signs of red spotting on the plates, I had to turn them down to like 80 milliamps, which is about 60% of their rated dissipation. And honestly, it's not a whole lot more than what a KT88 or a good KT88 tube can be biased at. And I was going, what is going on? So started doing some research. I even went back to the amp, disconnected the coupling cap, disconnected the feedback loop. So the only thing going to the tube was the plate voltage, screen voltage. Pulled the heat shrink tubing off so I could measure both sides of the screen stopper resistor, so I could measure the screen current. And obviously we can measure the cathode current here, and it all looked like totally within specs of the tube. So next I went online and started talking to some folks, and people were saying, is the tube oscillating? Well, there's no input signal. There's no way it can be oscillating. And so I know that's not the problem. So, disconnecting the tube from the input signal to me ruled out all of that stuff. We're basically just running current through the tube. And then someone else suggested, well, maybe these tubes are only designed to be used in push-pull amps, which obviously would be biased lower than you would in a single-ended amp. So I went back and looked at the data sheet, and actually the only example that they show is a single-ended amp. And they're showing it running at higher dissipation rates than I was at 110 milliamps. And so I'm going like, what is going on? And like, why is only one side of the tube getting hot and the other side's fine? So I went deeper down this rabbit hole, and it turns out that these tubes are notorious for doing this. And they're also notorious, if you listen to the folks that are manufacturing some of these high-end amps that use these tubes, that they're having to go through piles of these tubes to find sets that don't red plate when they're run anywhere close to their design specs. And what I have a feeling is going on is these tubes, especially now with the embargoes on Russian stuff, the ones that are left in the pipeline were rejects from previous, sortings of these tubes, trying to find sets that would run at their rated specs. And even though I bought this set of KT120s prior to COVID, they're not capable of running at their rated specifications, which basically means you have to set them at around 40 watts on a 60 watt tube, which obviously lowers the power output of these monoblocks to just over 10 watts versus the 18 watts that we were hoping to get out of them. So I ordered a pair of KT150 tubes from a reliable source. I'm not going to name them because I just don't want they don't have anything to do with this. So I get 2 tubes. One of them will bias at 100 milliamps. When you set it to 110, you start seeing the plate on one side glow. The other tube, it'll start red plating at 90 milliamps, which those are supposed to be 70 watt tubes. And you can look at it, and the tube's not only like tilted in its base, but the internal components look tilted, which is telling me that the elements inside the tube aren't aligned. And I think what's going on is the quality control on these is so crappy that the cathode is not centered between the plates. And so it's closer to one plate than the other, which means that the majority of the current's all going to one side of the tube, which is making that side of the tube overheat. And so, bottom line is, I'm not sure if it's possible without going through a pile of tubes or finding someone that's willing to do that to be able to build a pair of these that will run at the rated specs on the data sheet. Which gets back to just the whole tube industry has gotten so shady, it's no wonder people are shying away from getting involved with tube gear, given how poor the quality control is, not only on the amplifiers themselves, but also the tubes that you can buy to put in them if you build them yourself. And like, these are new old stock RCA driver tubes. They're being run really close to the rated dissipation. They're not even close to red plating or thinking about it. Where these, if you start running them past 60% of their rating, the anodes start glowing red on one side. And, I'm super disappointed to have to be making this video because I know a lot of folks out there were super excited about building these, and maybe you still are. And these can be, nice sounding, but realize that it's not really going to be much more powerful than, your kind of plain Jane KT88 amp, unless you luck out and get some tubes that are actually made correctly. And you're probably wondering, what are these cameras doing here? Well, I've got a long history of dealing with crappy made in Russia products. Years ago, when everybody was shooting film, there were no digital cameras. Medium format, or using 120 roll film, the larger format, was the way to higher quality. And there were Hasselblads and some other, high-end 120 film cameras, but they were super expensive. And the budget way of doing it was, hey, there are these Kiev cameras that are made in the Soviet Union that use 120 roll film and claim to be, great cameras. Well, the same deal is true. I went through about a dozen of these before I found one that even worked right and didn't have light leaks or shutter banding or, just straight up would jam. And the same thing with the lenses. While the lens formula was really good, you might go through 10 lenses before you found one that was even decent. And eventually, I spent the money to have this kind of cottage industry in Russia that was rebuilding these into quality cameras. And even those people were shady. There was one company that was like the real Heartbly, and then because there's no copyright laws in Russia, some other company was claiming to be Heartbly, putting that name on it, and making junk clone cameras where all they're doing is sticking badges on them and claiming they were rebuilt. But I was able to find like the real Heartbly from somebody that lived in Russia and was able to get one of these that was rebuilt into something that was a high quality, great user camera. But that gets back to what I'm talking about here. Unless you know somebody, I'm not sure you can get a pair of these tubes that will actually run at their published specifications. And I'll put a link below to a DIY audio article or thread from 5 years ago when they were talking about all the problems that people were having with these tubes, and I don't believe it's changed. It's probably actually gotten worse. And so I don't know what to do. I mean, do I tell people, yes, this is a great project and build this, when you can't buy tubes that will meet the specs that this design needs to actually make the power that it's supposed to? And then, like I said, you can bias these tubes down. That's what a couple of people on the forum said to do, is just bias them down till they quit glowing red and call it a day. You can do that, but if you're building these because you've got inefficient speakers that need 15 watts to actually perform what you expect it to sound like, I'm not sure you can get that out of these. And that sucks for these folks that are making these output transformers, because you can't buy tubes that'll actually work with what they're making is a great product. The shady Russians are selling tubes that are junk, in my opinion. And I've run into that with the JJ5AR4s. There's another example of a shady tube. Why those are still on the market is beyond me. I guarantee you, if I pulled out these gold lions and dropped in a JJ5AR4 and turned it on, there'd be a lightning storm inside the tube, it'd blow the fuse, and we'd be done. And they're rated to the same specifications that these tubes are, but again, these gold lion tubes, they seem to be pretty good. But I've got examples of like the 300B gold lion tubes. People buy those, put them in an amp that ran fine with another, even the PSV 300B tube. They put the gold lions in, turn the amp on, and they start red plating. And so it's like the Wild West out there. And it's frustrating, especially when I spent over $300 for a pair of KT150s, and that's what you end up with, is a wonky pair that are supposed to be a match set, and they don't even begin to meet the published specifications. And I've done enough testing now where I know that it's the tube and it's not the amplifier. I guess the other thing I wanted to add is, when these tubes are starting to glow red, they're not in thermal runaway. The bias is stable, and it's not like the grid voltage is going up positive and, they're going into nuclear meltdown mode. It's just they can't dissipate the power that they claim they can. And again, I think it's because the tube elements aren't aligned correctly, and so it's overheating one side of the tube, and like one of the plates has got 80% of the power going to it, and the other's got 20%, and that just blows it out of being able to deal with the power that the tube's actually asked to dissipate. So, again, I hate to be a downer, but actually, I don't want to say I'm depressed, but this is just depressing to think that I've invested this much energy, time, and my money and excitement into doing this, and then it turns out that these tubes are just BS hype and they're not even what they claim to be. Or you can't, at least you can't buy a pair that meet their specifications. And I guess an analogy would be like some car claims it's got 500 horsepower, and then you take it to the dyno and 19 out of 20 of them only make 350 horsepower, and then one of them will meet the specification. And why we're putting up with that, and they're not just rejecting all the tubes, is beyond me. It's just, yeah. And the sad thing is that, you know, when people try to manufacture these in countries that don't have those issues, that then the price point gets so high that nobody will pay for that. And people aren't willing to pay for quality. I mean, I would pay $800 for a pair of these tubes that would actually meet spec. But that's not where we're at. So anyway, I'm not sure where this project's going to go from here. I really wanted this to be a pair of high-powered single-ended amps, and it's going to end up being maybe 12 watts. We'll do some testing on what I can set these at without the anodes glowing red. It might be 10 watts. You know, and like I said, they sound nice. I'm probably going to listen to them, but it's definitely not what I was expecting. And I feel really bad for you folks that were gathering parts to build these, knowing that, hey, here's a 15 plus watt single-ended amp that I can build, and I'm not sure it's possible. And it makes me sad to think that, you know, you guys out there that are watching my channel got hyped up because I was excited, and now it turns out that, yeah, it was BS. I want to apologize that, and I know this isn't my fault, that I'm not manufacturing these tubes, but I guess I should have known from my experience in the past, like here's another shady Russian product. I just bought this the other day, and I'm thinking, hey, here's a cool little panoramic camera. You know, it was used, but I'm thinking, hey, everything seems to work okay and everything. Went out and tested it yesterday, and it's got light leaks, and there's big spots all over the negative from God only knows where. And I'm thinking to myself, of course there is. It's freaking made in Russia. And I should have known better than to trust that a company in Russia would actually make products that match the data sheets that they put out there. So here we are. You know, I was actually planning on building a matching preamp for these things, and it's just taking the wind out of my sails. I don't even know if I want to bother with that, or what I'm going to do with these now. I mean, I guess I could put some different tube sockets in them and change it over to some other kind of tube. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with these. I mean, they are finished. I'm probably going to listen to them for a while, but I'm not sure that I'm actually going to put my skunky label on them. They don't meet my expectations of what these should be. So, anyway, hate to bring this depressing news. And again, I really feel bad for doing a whole video series on this build without having final tested these things and assuming that the tubes that they're selling will actually meet the specifications that they publish. Anyway, thanks for following. Thanks for watching the channel. You know, I try to be brutally honest, maybe too much for some people, but yeah, it seems like lately I've been finding more people in the audio industry lying about their products than people actually telling the truth, which is depressing. That's where we are today in this world. That people feel it's okay to sell totally substandard stuff and not have any qualms about doing it. So anyway, hope you're enjoying my channel. If you are, please subscribe. Please like the video. Thanks to all you Patreon supporters and folks that make donations at the site. I'll try to do some updates on this when I get the energy to look at it again. I was hoping to do some driver tube changes and bias points and showing load lines and all that, but this is really just like, I'm almost like, why bother? So probably going to jump into, I've got the R300 that we've got to try to figure out why that was being sold with design failed power supplies. And then I've got what should be a Mark II version of the R8 that hopefully they've corrected all the flaws that I found with the original version of that, but we'll see. I think it's time to kind of shift and go back into that mode, and we'll come back to these later. So anyway, till then, have a nice day.